terrorism. This word has become a ubiquitous part of American political discourse in the last 15 years. It has shaped how we, collectively, think about and engage with the world around us, and it has greatly impacted how professors such as myself study and teach about Islam. The first problem that crops up in any discussion of terrorism is the fact that there is no agreed-upon definition of the word terrorism. The FBI, Department of State, and Department of Homeland Security all use different definitions of the word, and none of these definitions make it clear how terrorism might be distinguished from, say, guerrilla warfare. Furthermore, all definitions of terrorism revolve around establishing the intention and motivations behind acts of violence. And while some people who commit violent acts express these directly, many do not. For these reasons, I'm going to avoid using the word terrorism, but I am going to discuss at length mass attacks committed by both Muslims and non-Muslims. I'm going to start by walking you through the historical factors that led to the growth of two of the most infamous organizations today, al-Qaeda and ISIS. I'm then going to discuss the attacks committed by these groups in the Middle East and Asia, Europe, and the United States. Finally, I will focus on the United States and situate attacks committed by Muslims against the larger context of mass violence in this country. The September 11th attacks in 2001 on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon were organized and implemented by al-Qaeda under the leadership of Osama bin Laden, who was a citizen of Saudi Arabia. Al-Qaeda is unique among violent religious organizations because it has no ties to any geographical territory. Members of al-Qaeda see themselves as fighting against the forces of evil and injustice in the world, and believe that they can do so from any location. In the 90s, Afghanistan was controlled by an organization called the Taliban, who took control of the country after the United States helped them in their war against the Soviet Union. The Taliban offered refuge to Osama bin Laden and other members of al-Qaeda, who successfully built up an international network, broadcast messages, and planned and carried out a series of international attacks leading up to September 11th. In response to 9/11, the United States invaded Afghanistan, overthrew the Taliban government, and began a long search for Osama bin Laden. However, many of the resources devoted to the war against the Taliban in Afghanistan were then redirected in 2003 when an international coalition led by the United States invaded Iraq on the basis of false intelligence suggesting that Saddam Hussein might be hiding weapons of mass destruction. The United States military did not fully withdraw from Iraq until 2011, leaving behind a corrupt and ineffective Iraqi government, a fractured and demoralized Iraqi military, and a devastated infrastructure. 1 year later, in 2012, the civil war in Syria broke out. Then, in 2013, one of al-Qaeda's leaders in Iraq, a man named Baghdadi, split away from al-Qaeda with a large block of his supporters. This group renamed themselves the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and were able to gain control over territory in war-torn northern Syria. From there, they launched an offensive into Iraq in 2014, and the demoralized Iraqi army gave away quickly before them. The founding members of al-Qaeda and ISIS have very different ideologies and agendas. Al-Qaeda has no interest in conquering or controlling territory. In contrast, ISIS declared a new state in Iraq and Syria in 2014, fought to expand and defend their territory, and attempted to administer the areas under their control, building infrastructure, paying teachers, and setting up legal systems. One reason for the difference is that the founding members of ISIS seemed concerned with fulfilling prophecies concerning the apocalypse, which they thought would start when the armies of an Islamic State faced the armies of the West in northern Syria. Al-Qaeda and ISIS are also distinguished by their attitude towards Muslims who disagree with them. While attacks by al-Qaeda often result in the deaths of Muslims, spokesmen for al-Qaeda present themselves as waging a war against Western powers and suggest that the deaths of Muslims amount to collateral damage in this war. In contrast, ISIS actively promotes the killing of all Muslims that refuse to join their cause, and indeed, the vast majority of attacks by ISIS are carried out in Muslim-majority countries in the Middle East and Asia. However, despite the ideological differences between al-Qaeda and ISIS, the two groups share at least one common feature. Both groups established themselves in countries destabilized by over a decade of war. Al-Qaeda was granted refuge in Afghanistan after the end of the US-Soviet proxy war and the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1989, and ISIS took root in Iraqi territories pummeled after a decade of war with US-led troops. As I mentioned before, the vast majority of people killed in attacks by ISIS have been Muslims living in the Middle East and Asia. With the exception of the 9/11 attacks, almost all of the deadly attacks by Muslims in the United States have been carried out by American-born citizens, and almost all the mass attacks in Europe were carried out by European citizens. 9/11 style attacks by nationals of one country against nationals of another are extremely rare, as are attacks by immigrants. In fact, according to a report by the Cato Institute, immigrants are much less likely to commit any kind of crime than native-born Americans. And although news media reports focus disproportionately on attacks committed by Muslims, the vast majority of politically motivated attacks in the United States are committed by members of right-wing, anti-government groups. From 2002 to 2012, there were 14 successful attacks by Muslims in the United States, resulting in 39 deaths. In contrast, according to one study, there were over 337 right-wing attacks, resulting in 254 deaths over the same time period. In 2015, a survey of 382 law enforcement agencies found that 74% listed anti-government violence as one of the top 3 threats to their organization, as opposed to the 39% who listed violence by Muslim extremists. What both Muslim and right-wing extremists seem to have in common is the sense that they are abandoned or even under attack in their home country. Muslims who carry out attacks report feeling marginalized or discriminated against for their religion or ethnicity. In contrast, right-wing attackers are more likely to blame an overreaching government, religious minorities such as Jews, or people of color for depriving them of resources or opportunities. And of course, not all mass violence is politically motivated. In 2015 alone, there were 335 mass shootings in the United States, resulting in the deaths of 369 people. Only 2 of these incidents were linked to Muslims. So, first, when it comes to the growth of violent organizations abroad, I would like you to consider the role that the United States, as a country, has played in destabilizing first Afghanistan and then Iraq. Second, when it comes to politically motivated violence in the United States, I would like you to look beyond religious identity and to ask yourselves why so many people in this country feel that they have been abandoned, oppressed, or marginalized. What are the sources of the anger, fear, and hatred that we direct against one another? And finally, I would like you to think seriously about the root causes of the mass shootings across the country and about how we deal with and talk about substance abuse and serious mental illness. There is more than religion at work here.